All for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander.
Where are me crew,
Me crew.
me jolly, jolly crew?
They're all gone for beer and tobacco.
Since the COVID came around and the pubs all they shut down, now I'm missing singing songs with you together.
Oh, all for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander. Yes, across the western ocean I must wander.
Welcome, everyone. This is Joan Whitlow, the Executive Director at the Customs House Maritime Museum. Thank goodness it's Friday. I think we all are a bit exhausted up to this last moment. I just want to give a few game rules for the next hour. Mics and videos will remain off just to reduce the distractions. And at the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So in order not to forget your question, you might want to jot it down in the text. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the evening. Once the presentation is done, we will also invite you to unmute yourselves. And if you care to turn on your video, then that's the time to do so. So, despite winter hours, the museum is preparing for spring. A big thanks to the Lowe's Boat Shop for the Newbury and for the Newburyport Art Association for trusting us to care for their dory and art sculpture. Passerbys have really enjoyed something visual in the bleak of the winter landscape. We have received by now you should have received an annual meeting notification for March 17th at 6:30. It will be a Zoom meeting, and yes, it will be recorded. I have been asked about that too. We are excited to have 5 new board members on the slate of nominees, and their bios have been provided, but they each bring an amazing different skill set so this organization can continue to thrive. Then, of course, legendary Newburyporters, sculpture by Jeffrey Briggs, is becoming the talk of the town. There are many new opportunities with this caliber of exhibition that can come to and bring to this community. I've been humbled by the array of support from presenting sponsors to the people who contributed their time, expertise, and knowledge to share. This whole initiative, exhibition, book, video, actually 2 videos, because we wanted to ensure that the exhibition would be accessible to all, not only with physical boundaries, but also just putting it on our web and allowing people to see the legendary Newburyporters themselves. So this whole initiative just sort of grew organically, and it continues to do so. The energy behind is still pushing to the public opening, which will be April the 2nd. And next month, we kick off the return to First Friday in person. So I think everyone will be looking forward to that. Now that the mandate has been lifted for internal spaces, it's wonderful to see people's faces. And some have actually shaved, and also to see their smiles. In March 1980, President Jimmy Carter declared that March 8th was officially the start of National Women's History Week, just a week. By 1987, Congress declared the entire month of March Women's History Month. The last several years at the Customs House Maritime Museum, we have been collaborating with the Actors Studio to kick off Newburyport's month-long Her Story events on the first Friday of the month. This also coincides with our members event. So welcome all who are attending from the Actors Studio. We welcome you. It's nice to have you on this evening. And also consider becoming a member here too. So be sure to check out the Newburyport acting.org website for a schedule of events They really are filled every weekend for the month at various venues and with some really great subjects and topics. Bonnie Hurd Smith grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, and quickly discovered her love for history when she could imagine a world very different from her own. She went on to Simmons College in Boston and drew upon her love of history, but also her passion for uncovering and telling stories of women. A master's degree in communication management, she found herself years later a part-time executive director for a Boston Women's Heritage Trail. She had already helped lead a statewide project to honor historical women in Massachusetts State House and to help create a women's history trail on the South Shore of Massachusetts. So obviously it was the next step. She also collaborated with the Cambridge Women's History Project and eventually created the Salem, Mass. Women's Heritage Trail and the Boston's Women and the Law Trail. As if not doing enough, she joined the board at the Sargent House Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and met the most famous resident, Judith Sargent Murray, an 18th century essayist and women's rights advocate. Judith Sargent Murray would become Bonnie's master thesis at Simmons. Bonnie later left to pursue her own research on Murray and has since published 4 books on Murray's letters. She's now considered a leading scholar on Murray's life. Bonnie is an author, speaker, promoter, publisher, and an instigator. So please welcome Bonnie Hurd Smith.
Hi.
Hi, Bonnie, go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're all set with
Okay.
the sound, but now we need to have your picture and then you can take it from there. It's all yours.
Well, first of all, I'm just calling up my presentation. There it is. First of all, Joan, thank you for that introduction. And the one thing I'm not good at right at this minute is figuring out why my camera isn't functioning. So we're going to have to do this with just audio, but can you hear me okay?
I can see you just fine, and I can see your PowerPoint presentation on the desktop, so you're good.
We're good to go. All right. Well, thank you again, Joan, for the introduction, but also for inviting me to kick off Women's Herstory Month at your museum and in Newburyport. I am very eager for all of you to meet Judith Sargent Murray, and as the title suggests, to see her courage and faith in action. So this is going to be quite a ride through her life and accomplishments. So this is the woman you're about to meet, your neighbor from Gloucester, who believed it was her patriotic and civic duty to challenge the new American nation to improve the status of women and girls. She was the first to claim female equality in the public prints, the first woman in America to self-publish a book, the first American to have a play produced in Boston, the most important female essayist of the new American Republic, according to leading historians, the earliest known American Universalist author, the co-founder of a female academy, the only 18th century woman known to have kept letter books in a consistent manner, and I'll explain more about that. And her letter books provide a new and a female eyewitness account of a pivotal time in our history. So these were the high points of the actions she took: writing, at a time when women were not yet speaking in public and using her vast and impressive network to full advantage. But why her? After all, Judith didn't really have to do anything except marry and have children, bringing honor to her family and more citizens for the new republic. She was born in 1751 into two of Gloucester's most prominent merchant class families, Saunders on her mother's side, Sargent on her father's. Gloucester at that time, still a colony of his Britannic Majesty, as Judith called him, was a more successful port than Salem or Boston. Her family was wealthy and engaged, and there's nothing like a bunch of Copley portraits to prove that, right? The men were well educated, private tutors in Harvard, and they were politically active. Her brother Winthrop, 2 years younger than she, followed in this tradition. When they were young, he was being tutored to prepare him for Harvard. He was studying history, science, philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, Latin, and Greek, using books in the Sargent family library. As a girl, this really ticked Judith off, to use present-day vocabulary. And interestingly, a family story has been perpetuated over the years that Judith studied alongside him, but I now know from her letters that this was not the case. When she was 57 years old, she wrote to Winthrop, "I have through life mourned the want of early instruction." Because as a young girl in a merchant class family, Judith was only taught basic reading and writing skills by a woman she would later call her ill-taught preceptress. But primarily she was taught the dozens of domestic tasks associated with caring for a merchant class household to prepare her for what was expected. But what she did was make use of the family library, and she began a lifelong process of self-education that surpassed any expectation of her. We know that Judith's favorite book when she was 16 was The Economy of Human Life, a book of ancient Brahmin Indian lessons on morality. So we know that from a fairly early age, Judith was interested in ethics, philosophy, and in determining for herself a moral truth. On the end paper of the book, she wrote the best book that ever was written. Judith was also a scribbler from a very young age. She once told the Reverend William Emerson, meaning a writer, quote, "Ere I had completed my 9th year, she told him, I had written a little work, which in the simplicity of my years, I determined an history." She made humble attempts at poetry as well, and she wrote letters like this one to her dear papa. All of this she was allowed to do only after her domestic chores were completed. Her mother extended her this freedom, and her father showed off her compositions to family members, facts whose importance cannot be overstated. And throughout Judith's life until her parents passed away, she remained deeply grateful and loyal to these two unusual 18th century parents. When she was 18, Judith did the expected. She married a sea captain 10 years her senior, named John Stevens Jr. And soon after, she sat for her portrait by Copley. John Stevens owned 10 vessels, like the one on your screen, that sailed to England and the West Indies, trading primarily in fish and lumber. He was an enterprising businessman who was known for taking risks and the son of one of Gloucester's most prominent families. In many respects, Judith had married well and appropriately. It was now 1770, and Judith's world was changing fast. What we now call the Boston Massacre took place, and talk of separation from Britain dominated colonial conversations. Gloucester, closely connected by sea and by sentiment to Boston and trade activities, would not be isolated from what was to come. Coupled with political change was intellectual change in Europe and eventually here. Enlightenment thinking was dismantling the status quo in favor of individual liberty and capacity. Literacy was on the rise, and people were reading the Bible for themselves and questioning the standard interpretation of the scriptures. You can see the basic concepts of Enlightenment thinking described here, which really laid the groundwork for what was about to come. One of the men involved in new religious ideas was John Murray, who was born in Alton, England in 1741. He was a colleague of James Raleigh, whose book, Union, or a Treatise on the Consanguinity and Affinity between Christ and his Church, is considered the founding document of Universalism. His liberal religious message, thoroughly grounded in a different scriptural interpretation, was anti-Calvinist, anti-hellfire and brimstone, and instead put forth a loving God whose promise of universal redemption for the faithful included everyone. Winthrop Sargent, Judith's father, had read James Raleigh's book and embraced this new way of thinking that included the concept of the equality of all souls. A small group of Universalists, including Judith, had been meeting in the Sargent family home to discuss this theology. In 1774, Winthrop Sargent learned that John Murray was preaching in Boston, and he rode down to invite him to Gloucester. Judith was a 23-year-old married woman when she and John Murray first met that year. He was 33, and that first meeting was clearly electric. She had found an intellectual and spiritual mentor. In her first letter to him, she told him they would, with the strictest propriety, mingle souls upon paper, and they did regularly. At about this time, perhaps because there was so much momentous change in the air, Judith decided to start copying the letters she was writing to friends and family into blank volumes called letter books, like this one. As a student of history, Judith knew the value of writing things down. As an eyewitness to extraordinary events, as someone who had the resources to purchase books, paper, and ink, the time to create these documents, and the literacy skills, she was determined to do this work for future generations to have. She was serious and methodical in her approach. Knowing this would be a multi-volume, multi-year effort, she began her first volume with this statement, in which she tells us at the beginning of the book that she committed to the flames nearly all my letters written previous to the year 1774. And at the end of the statement, you see her desire to commend these volumes of letters to affectionate posterity. And I have to stress how unusual this was. Most women at this time, even if they were literate, did not think their thoughts and experiences were worth recording. But Judith did. Lucky for us. She left the first few pages of her letter books blank so that when each volume was full, she could go back and create a table of contents. This is the one for letter book 1. And you can see how she listed the recipient of each letter and the page number on which the letter appears. She also numbered the letters themselves, and in later letter books, she included that piece of information in the table of contents as well. By the time Judith completed her last letter book in 1818 at the age of 67, she had created 20 volumes and copied approximately 5,000 letters. and she had a lot to write about. When Indians, in quotes, dumped tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, Britain responded punitively and closed Boston's port. The political world is in a ferment, she wrote to her brother, and sober reason must, I should imagine, be apprehensive of the consequences. Gloucester had voted to support Boston's actions, and they now lived in fear of the mightiest navy in the world. All along the coast, 1774 and 75 were tense years, when the British went in search of stockpiles of guns and ammunition in Concord. The first blood of the Revolutionary War was shed in Lexington, and the British patrolled the waters off Gloucester to prevent arms and goods from getting out. There were terrifying battles off the coast that Judith witnessed. In a letter to John Murray, she documented, "Upon the day of your departure, the arrival of a schooner belonging to His Britannic Majesty threw our people into great alarm. Immediately, the drums beat to arms, the bells sounded portentously, and the streets were filled with the goods of the terrified inhabitants. We continued in a state of distressing suspense, all our men bearing arms even to their place of worship. Words are inadequate to describe the panic. Our men bravely prepared for opposition." Judith's family, like many wealthy traders, did not support separation from Britain at first, but as time went on, they embraced the patriotic cause. Her brother, Winthrop, joined the military in Cambridge, where Washington first took command. He would eventually serve as an officer under Generals Howe and St. Clair, and he became General Washington's friend. Judith's father joined Gloucester's Committee of Safety. Her uncle, Paul Dudley Sargent, rose to the rank of colonel. Her uncle Epps and Aunt Catherine, loyalists, almost left for Halifax, but decided to stay with their families in Gloucester and deal with whatever would come. John Murray served briefly as chaplain to 3 Rhode Island regiments. Well, by 1780, immediate war activities had moved south, and the Gloucester Universalists were able to complete and dedicate their new meeting house, the first Universalist meeting house in America, calling John Murray as their pastor. It had taken enormous effort for the Universalists to arrive at this day because, remember, in these days, church and state were one. The legality of John Murray's ministry had been challenged since he had first arrived in America, including in Gloucester. He had even been threatened. The Universalists, including Judith, had been suspended for not attending the first parish, and articles of value had been seized by the tax assessors in lieu of the taxes the Sargents and other Universalists refused to pay. The lawsuit they brought before the Supreme Judicial Court, arguing for their right to support their own minister and church, was eventually settled in their favor. And it was the first legal ruling for freedom of religion in this country. And it happened in Gloucester, Massachusetts, thanks to the Universalists. Judith took on the role of religious educator for the Universalist children. In fact, the parents of these children asked her to write down what she was teaching. And in 1782, Judith published a catechism for young readers, which explains Universalist theology in an easy to follow question and answer format. It is considered the earliest writing by a Universalist woman in America. And it included in its introduction a statement that asserted male and female equality. This was the beginning of her public, literary, and political journey. Now, with confidence, she was ready to go a step further into the public prints and present her ideas on female equality and education, joining a national conversations, plural, I should say, that were taking place now that the Constitution had been ratified. In the October 1784 issue of the Gentleman and Ladies Town and Country magazine, Judith published desultory thoughts upon the utility of encouraging a degree of self-complacency, especially in female bosoms. I love 18th century titles. She used the pen name Constantia, which she would use throughout her literary career, as women were not supposed to use their real name in public. And this was the first of many essays Judith would write on girls' self-esteem, on encouraging their aspirations, or, as she put it, teaching girls from an early age to reverence themselves. Unfortunately, Judith almost immediately had to suspend her essay writing as her personal life took a devastating turn. John Stevens, her husband, had fallen into enormous debt after the war, and creditors, if they could get him, wanted to throw him into debtor's prison. This is where they were living at the time. Today, this is, of course, the Sargent House Museum. Judith's letters from this home document the frightening winter they spent barricaded in their house with only one fire. As she wrote to a friend, the corroding apprehension that an enemy is constantly laying in ambush for our destruction furnishes the necessity of bolts and bars which alike exclude both friends and foes. Judith never forgot the experience of living in poverty and how few options she had to earn money and help her family besides taking in sewing, which was her plan. Years later, she would publish a number of essays that challenged the social barriers, keeping women from being able to earn a living more easily and from managing their own money. Eventually, after an enormous effort to secure relief from his creditors, John Stevens fled Gloucester for St. Eustatius in the West Indies. Judith became despondent and very ill. Almost 4 months went by before she heard from her husband, and when he wrote from St. Eustatius, he told her he had borrowed more money to purchase a warehouse and goods. But soon, Judith received word that John Stevens had died. She was now widowed and poor. She was finally free to marry the man she had come to truly love, John Murray, but he had been advised to leave Gloucester for his safety. There were renewed threats to his ministry and to his personal safety, and he left for England in January of 1788. Months went by before a new lawsuit was settled, and finally, Judith was able to write to him, "My dear, my protecting friend is returning. There is no longer a necessity for his banishment, and I shall be, in short, I shall be very happy. 1,000 times a day do I whisper the tidings to my soul. This letter is intended to meet you in Boston. Welcome then, my dearest friend. Thou art right welcome to the soul of thy Constantia." Judith and John celebrated their marriage by traveling south to Rhode Island, where John preached. Along the way, they stayed here in Braintree with John's friends, the Adamses. Judith met them for the first time, writing, "In the countenance of Mr. Adams, the most pleasing benevolence mingles with the marks of deep thinking, and you immediately conclude the qualities which constitute the sage, the philosopher, the politician, and the man of unbending integrity. Mr. Adams hath undoubtedly united uncommon natural abilities with extensive knowledge. His writings proclaim his erudition. His station hath been highly dignified, and being considered in a political sense as the representative of free, independent, and sovereign states, he hath stood before kings upon an equal and undisputed level. He is unquestionably an ornament to our country and to human nature in general. Judith also met Abigail Adams for the first time, whom she found not unduly elevated nor spoiled by the adulatory incense of surrounding flatterers. She wrote, "She is not only his bosom friend, but his aid and his counselor in every emergency. And such are the energies of her mind as to place her title to the unbounded confidence of her illustrious husband beyond all controversy. Several gentlemen in Boston, whose character and influence are high in the political world, declare that was the president called out of time, they should rather see Mrs. Adams in the presidential chair than any other character now existing in America." Think about that. President Abigail Adams. Well, when Judith and John returned to Gloucester, Judith was pregnant. But sadly, the baby boy they had planned to name Fitz Winthrop was stillborn. She was 38 years old and devastated by this loss. She thought it was her last chance for motherhood. And from her letters, it is clear that this was her single greatest wish. Judith consoled herself in two ways. First, through her deep and unwavering belief in the world beyond. "Our loved ones are not lost," she once wrote to her sister-in-law. "They are only gone before, and they are safely lodged in that paradise where our vacant seats will not long remain unoccupied." And in fact, Judith's faith permeates her letters and her essays. God was a central, active, and guiding presence in her life. The other way Judith consoled herself was in her writing. The heart-wrenching poem, Lines Occasioned by the Death of an Infant, was published in the Massachusetts Magazine in February of 1790 under the pen name Constantia. And now Judith also returned to the political writing she had abandoned years earlier. In its March and April issues of 1790, the Massachusetts Magazine published the groundbreaking two-part essay on the equality of the sexes by Constantia, in which Judith argued forcefully and convincingly that women's minds were just as capable and rational as men's, that if women seemed lacking intellectually, it was only through want of education. This essay is considered the first published work in America that asserted women's inherent equality. In her essay, Judith wrote, "I would calmly ask, is it reasonable that a candidate for immortality, for the joys of heaven, an intelligent being who is to spend an eternity in contemplating the works of deity, should at present be so degraded as to be allowed no other ideas than those suggested by the mechanism of a pudding or the sewing of the seams of a garment? Are we deficient in reason? We can only reason from what we know. And if opportunity of acquiring knowledge hath been denied us, the inferiority of our sex cannot fairly be deduced from thence." Judith's writing and her politics were now very much in the public arena. She had a voice and a following. In May, the Massachusetts Magazine published her essay on the domestic education of children, in which Judith discussed the best way to motivate and discipline children by example, not corporal punishment. Do blows ever produce a salutary effect upon a gentle or a generous disposition? It can hardly be presumed that they do. Is it not more than probable that they tend to make an obstinate being still more perverse? Later in 1790, Judith and John traveled to Philadelphia for the first National Universalist Convention. Part of their journey took them to New York, then the seat of the American government, where Judith observed a session of Congress held here in the Federal Building. In a letter to her parents, she wrote, "We took our seats in that superb hall where the delegates of the United States were so lately convened in council. Suddenly, rude and tumultuous sounds are heard, frightfully terrific. What sounds are these? Every eye seems to ask. It is the song of praise as sung by the kings, chiefs, and warriors of the Creek nation, sounding their untutored joy. Thus is the assembly disposed when the illustrious President of the United States appears, habited in vestments of rich purple satin. His address was solemn and proper, and the signing of the treaty succeeded. And now the kings, chiefs, and warriors, one by one, advance, and they join hands in peace, seizing the president by the elbow, entwining their arms with his, and a second song of peace by the Indians concluded this affecting, important, and dignified transaction." Judith and John dined with the Washingtons, Judith meeting the president for the first time. As she told her parents, "My eyes had never before beheld him, but it was not necessary he should be announced. That dignity by which he is distinguished could not belong to another. His figure is elegant beyond what I have ever seen. His countenance is benignly good, and there is a kind of venerable gravity inscribed upon every feature." Judith also made a lifelong friend of Martha Washington, whose face is an index of a good heart, she wrote, "and those virtues which I am told she eminently possesseth are impressed upon every feature." Well, without the benefit of 18th century videotape, we have to rely on the written word to convey the powerful effect the charismatic John Murray had on his audiences. During this journey in 1790, Judith described his preaching in New Jersey during a sudden rainstorm. In his own animated, energetic, and devout manner, the preacher proceeded, and every countenance confessed the most solemn attention. The rustling of the leaves, the singing of the birds were not heard. During the intermission, scarce a person quitted the spot, and I listened in enraptured silence to the various comments. One aged Black man in the midst of the discourse softly exclaimed to a bystander, "Blessed God, is there then redemption for a poor slave as well as for his more happy master?" For myself, I was beyond expression affected. Tears of transport often trembled in my eye. Indeed, language must ever be inadequate to delineate the sensations of a chaste and tender wife as she takes her seat among the admiring crowd and hangs with the enlightened multitude upon the hallowed lips of the revered and beloved Lord of her wishes. And so, needless to say, this journey in 1790 must have reinforced for Judith a sense of her place in history and the importance of putting forth her ideas in her essays and her letters. Returning home, Judith was soon able to pen this letter to her mother after giving birth at the age of 41 to a baby girl she named Julia Maria. "Well, my mama," she wrote, as you can see down at the bottom, "how good is the God with whom we have to do. Hardly for a single moment did I dare to indulge a hope of the blessing which is now in my possession. I am indeed a happy mother." However, the health of both mother and daughter would always be fragile. Now, Judith decided to try something new with her writing when she developed her Gleaner column. Her family and friends all knew who Constantia was, and she came to a resolution to assume a signature unknown to my connections, thus hoping to obtain their real sentiments. This time, Judith wanted to be free to write about any subject she chose and to have her ideas considered and not dismissed. To accomplish this, she decided to use a male persona to avoid the indifference, not to say contempt, with which female productions are regarded. The Gleaner, installment #1, appeared in the February 1792 Massachusetts magazine, and nobody, not even John Murray, knew who the author was. The column developed quite a following as he discussed federalism, the Constitution, the state of our nation, marriage, courtship and raising children, violence, philanthropy, industry and virtue, religion, debtor's prison, the theater, and of course, female education and abilities. She began a second series in the Massachusetts magazine in September called The Repository, this time resuming her identity as Constantia. And this column she used for more philosophical, theological, and reflective writing. She wrote essays against war and violence, on the beauty of nature and our responsibility to it, on compassion for others less fortunate, on personal fortitude, death, loneliness, friendship, philanthropy, and universalism. Meanwhile, the Universalists in Boston had asked John to serve as their minister. Their meeting house was located in the North End, and the small family moved to Boston in 1794 to Franklin Place. It was in the midst of the thriving metropolis, where Judith and John would be in a key center of political thought and activity, culture, trade, newspapers, and publishers. Franklin Place also housed the Boston Library Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, above the Central Arch. Judith was already an established essayist when she arrived in Boston, and Thomas Paine, not to be confused with Common Sense Thomas Paine, this Thomas Paine, the editor of the Federal Orrery, Boston's leading Federalist newspaper, lost no time in asking her to submit work to his publication. Never one to turn down a flattering request, Judith developed a new series for him called The Reaper. In it, she would share with her readers important lessons she had reaped from common life experiences, lessons on character and virtuous behavior, her favorite subjects. The Reaper #1 appeared on Monday, October 20th of 1794, but only 4 more succeeded it. Mr. Paine, as she called him, edited her work far too extensively, and Judith simply wouldn't have it. She stopped submitting her work. Undaunted, Judith now tried her hand at playwriting. In 1795 and 96, her satirical plays, The Medium or Happy Tea Party and The Traveler Returned, were performed at Boston's Theater on Federal Street. She was doing this at a time, let's remember, when American writers were not considered on a par with Europeans. So Judith was blazing new trails for the next generation of writers, and her plays are considered the first by an American writer to be produced in Boston. And now Judith began to work on what would be her greatest literary achievement and what she hoped would bring her fame. She wrote to George Washington for his early support. This is a woman who knew marketing. She wanted to publish her Gleaner essays as a book, including many unpublished essays, and she would finance the book by selling subscriptions. Deign, honored sire, to set your name to the enclosed proposals and thus give éclat to the production they announce. she wrote to Washington. She knew that if he said yes, others would follow. She also wrote to John Adams, saying, "Sir, I would give celebrity to my essays by your name, and I solicit your patronage, not only as a subscriber to my proposals, but penetrated by the most profound veneration for your character and your virtues. I earnestly request permission to dedicate the volumes I contemplate to you." Both men agreed to subscribe. And now Judith solicited more subscribers to raise money to pay for her book, using the names of Adams and Washington for leverage. And guess what? It worked. 740 people subscribed in advance, all of them listed at the end of volume 3, starting with John Adams in large type. The Gleaner, a miscellaneous production in 3 volumes, was published in March 1798. In it, Judith revealed her identity, explained why she had assumed a male persona, and she secured her place among leading thinkers and political figures of her day. And she made money, which her letters make clear she and John sorely needed to provide for themselves and for their daughter's future. In The Gleaner, she wrote, "Yes, in this younger world, the rights of women begin to be understood. We seem at length determined to do justice to the sex, and we are ready to contend for the quantity as well as the quality of mind. I may be accused of enthusiasm, but such is my confidence in the sex that I expect to see our young women forming a new era in female history." Judith's notoriety continued to grow with the publication of her book, particularly among American writers for whom she had helped pave important paths. In 1800, 2 novels were published in which she was praised. In The Oriental Philanthropist, Henry Sherburne wrote, "Happy talents, Constantia, are confessedly thine. How sweetly pleads thy pen in virtue's sacred cause, with sentiments ennobling, pathetic, and sublime, winning each selfish heart to charity and love. Columbia's sons and daughters shall never cease to bless thee. Future ages shall grateful own thy worth." And in her novel, Julia, Sally Wood wrote, "I have seldom met with a woman who converses more sensibly or with more propriety than Mrs. Murray. She has lately published The Gleaner, a periodical work in 3 volumes that does great honor both to her head and her heart. This production is not half so much praised and encouraged as it ought to be, but I am persuaded that years hence, The Gleaner will be universally read and admired." Also in the early 1800s, Judith was approached to help start a female academy in Dorchester. Judith Saunders, a cousin in Clementine Beach, asked Judith to use her stature as an advocate for female education to assist them, and she was only too happy to help. She wrote and placed advertisements like this one, found property for them, and helped recruit students. The academy opened on Dorchester's Meeting House Hill in 1803. Judith continued to publish her poetry, this time in the Boston Weekly magazine, under the pen name Honora Martesia. She also wrote a 3rd play, The African, which was performed only once before receiving a mortal stab from a critic. To date, the play's manuscript has never been found, which would be important to do, considering the Universalists were among the earliest organizations to condemn slavery. In 1809, the Universalists in Gloucester dedicated their new meeting house, a long way from the more modest building of 1780, and John Murray attended the officiating ceremonies. But later that month came a real blow. John Murray suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed and bedridden. Judith was stunned and heartbroken. His mind was still alert, but he was unable to work, and the Universalists found it increasingly difficult to maintain the Murray family and their new minister. America was soon to become involved in another war with Britain, and in Boston, that meant trade embargoes and the consequential failure of businesses, financial institution, and the Murrays' investments. As the spring of 1812 approached, Judith worked with John to compile letters and sketches of sermons, which they hoped would bring them the income they once again sorely needed. John was considered the father of American Universalism, and the book was important to complete. And soon after, the great John Murray, Judith's husband of 27 years, and her friend for 14 years before that, passed away. The response in Boston and far beyond was deeply felt. He had touched so many lives. His work for universalism and for religious tolerance forever changed this country. 2 services were held, one in Gloucester, the other in Boston, that included a long procession from their home at Franklin Place over to the Universalist meeting house and on to Granary burying ground where he was interred. Judith was approached to finish writing and editing John's autobiography, which she did, adding an introduction, and it was published in 1816. The Friend, I don't know if you can read it, but toward the bottom, you can see by a friend. The Friend cited there as the author of the brief continuation was Judith. Sadly, John had abandoned this work in 1774, so he did not write about his years with Judith, and she was too modest to go into detail. In 1818, Judith's daughter, Julia Maria, received word from her husband who had returned to his native Natchez. He wanted her to join him. Judith did not want to part with her daughter and granddaughter, Charlotte, so the 3 of them together made the long journey to Natchez. It was not at all how she wanted to end her days. She wanted to die in the same bed she had shared with John and be buried next to him. Well, what happened next is unclear. As yet, no letters have been recovered from Judith's brief time in Natchez. I don't have a photograph of the mansion she moved to, Fatherland, but this is her brother Winthrop's estate, Gloucester Place, where he had retired after serving as the first governor of the Mississippi Territory. His mansion was close by, and Judith visited there regularly to see the nieces and nephews she had helped raise. She was now 69 and unwell. Judith Sargent Murray died on June 9th, 1820, and was buried in the Binghamton Family Cemetery. Julia Maria inscribed on the stone, "Dear Spirit, the monumental stone can never speak thy worth." Later that fall, little Charlotte also died, and Julia Maria buried her next to her grandmother. Julia Maria gave birth to Adam Lewis Binghamton Jr. in 1821, but soon after, her health failed and she died at the age of 31. The son married and had a daughter who was childless, and as a result, there are no living direct descendants of Judith Sargent and John Murray. As for Judith's letter books, they moved with the Bingham family to a mansion called Arlington, and there they remained until 1984. That year, a Unitarian Universalist minister named Gordon Gibson, who was serving a church in the area, took it upon himself to determine if there wasn't something Judith had left behind. He had read the oft-repeated statement by a Universalist historian that Judith's personal papers had been destroyed long ago. But Gordon had also learned of a Bingham family Bible, and that was what he went in search of, and he found it. He inquired about other documents, and the owner of the Bible told him about some old copybooks at another mansion. Here in this home, he found what he calls and is a gold mine. And it's a lucky thing he did, because just a couple of years ago, Arlington's library was destroyed by fire. But what Judith Sargent Murray had so painstakingly written and left behind for future generations, we now have 20 volumes of letter books and approximately 5,000 letters. It is thanks to the discovery of Judith Sargent Murray's letter books that we finally have the tools we need to restore her voice to the American story. It is a voice of courage, intelligence, and wisdom, grounded in faith, that speaks clearly and deliberately to us across generations. Why her? Her family culture, her unusual support system, her literary abilities, her early economic privilege, her lived experiences of gender inequalities and economic failure, the times themselves, her Universalist faith. All these and more can answer that question. But there's one more thing I would add, and that's her. Some people who do the extraordinary cannot be explained, and I believe she's among them. Judith Sargent Murray is a unique and proud part of our heritage, and it has been my privilege to do this work and to share her unforgettable story with you today. These are just some of the books I've done about her or involving her. And with that, I am happy to turn things back to Joan and answer any questions anyone might have.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. That was actually very, very interesting. I've never heard of a letter book before. I actually am really curious if ever any of those 20-volume, 5,000 letters have turned up at one of the recipients' papers in another archive. That would be really interesting to see if you could ever find its mate,
Yes.
because you wrote two side by side.
Yes. The answer is yes. And the best example I could give is George Washington, because his papers were, lovingly, reverentially kept. And so they have her letters to him so that we can compare those side by side. That's the one example I can point to. She wrote a couple of letters to Mercy Otis Warren. They're probably at Mass Historical, and ditto the few letters she wrote to John Adams.
It not only shows the dedication, but the persistence over the years. It's just, I think I would have given up after a while with all of the life crises.
Yeah.
Is there somebody else that would like to ask a question? You're welcome to turn on your microphone or your video. I see a couple familiar faces.
Can I say something?
Absolutely, Deb.
Okay, you can hear me. First of all, that was really interesting. I really, really enjoyed this presentation. And we would have been friends, me and Judith. Anyway, I wanted to ask,
Great.
is the Universalist Meeting House in Gloucester, is that still standing?
No.
No,
You
okay.
can, the story about what happened to it is in Prudence Fish's book, Antique Houses of Gloucester. It was built on Sargent family property, and it was sold and sold and sold. And the last use that was being made of it was as sort of a barn, I want to say. If you think about how really simple the first structure was,
Mhm.
and it just
Yes.
over time fell apart. But I love
Okay.
the contrast between the first meeting house and then the one that is still there, as you know.
Right.
But if
Yeah.
I had time to show you a picture of John Murray's childhood church in England, magnificent Gothic stone,
Mm.
you know, architecture is
Mhm.
interesting.
Hmm.
So
Just one other, two other things. One is, why did John Murray have to leave and flee to England, which it seems like would have been after the Revolutionary War?
because he was a threat to the ruling ministers, congregational Calvinist ministers, because
Okay.
he was defying their doctrine. In Gloucester and Boston, some of these ministers denounced him in the public prints, wrote pamphlets denouncing him, and at various times it wasn't physically safe for him to be around. He was a threat.
Yeah.
And eventually and the Sargents, and it's interesting because Judith's uncle and aunt, who came very close to going to Halifax during right before the revolution, because they were loyalists and decided to stay. They were actually very instrumental in helping bring the lawsuit on behalf of the Universalists that led to the ruling. Yes, you have the legal right to have your own church, your own minister, and not pay taxes to the established church. So he was a threat.
I see. Yeah. And just one last thing. Where is Natchez? What's that?
Oh, Mississippi.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Judith moved to deep South slaveholding territory.
Mhm.
Quite a contrast.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me,
May she rest in peace.
yeah. Someone on the chat asked if John Murray had been married before. And the answer is yes. He was married in England, and his first wife died soon after giving birth to their child, who also passed away.
Mhm.
So when he came to America, he essentially came to die, to no longer bring shame to his family. He had been raised in the Methodist Church, and he had discovered Universalism and embraced Universalism. But with the death of his wife and his son, and his depression, and he lost a lot of money, was put in debtor's prison for a while. He felt that he had failed God, failed his family, and his plan was to come to America to live out the rest of his days, which he hoped weren't going to be many. He didn't believe in suicide. He came here to hide and die. That did not happen.
So Bonnie, I have a question. You mentioned about why Judith, and I look at, and I think about it, she obviously had a brilliant mind.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a gifted, I mean, if she was a male, she would have been very successful
knows?
and promoted, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you look at someone like her versus like a Hamilton, right? And now it's Alexander Hamilton, who was an orphan, who had at least he was a male, so he got the support. But as that, it's amazing. She was literally amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're
sharing.
welcome. Well, and can you imagine? I mean, I'm sure a lot of you out there, you women out there, have brothers. Can you imagine watching your brother, who is not as bright as you are, being tutored in really interesting and important subjects, and you're learning how to cook and sew? So, but as I say, her family culture, being well-educated, well-spoken, active, engaged, that was the family culture. And for whatever reason, that's what she wanted to be and do.
Yeah.
She had a sister who led a very, very traditional life. So
Very cool for her month. Thanks.
and very cool that her parents let her,
Yeah.
and I mean, my gosh, her father used to show off her writing to family members. So she had that support. And then she had John Murray, and what a difference.
Yeah.
So many of the women I study did not have anywhere near that kind of support. And she really did. She didn't she was very loved by her family, but in terms of her literary pursuits, her ideas, her politics, or whatever, those letters in particular are back and forth with men.
Have you done a lecture for the Universalist?
Oh yeah. Yep. I've done a lot of sermons on her. I've led services on her and on John Murray.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is there any last minute question? I know we've gone over a little bit on our time. Sorry for the little late start, but Bonnie, you pulled through beautifully. There's a question.
I have a question.
Yeah,
sure.
How supportive was her first husband to what she was doing, her writings? And
she is very maddeningly silent about that relationship. First of all, he was away a lot because he was not just sitting in Gloucester counting his money. He was on board those ships that he owned. So he was away a lot. I don't have an answer to that question, except that she started her writing career when she was still married to him. So maybe he didn't know until he got back. I don't know. She's quite silent on the subject of him. She refers to him as a highly, respectable person, etc. But clearly John Murray, I often say to people, it's like you're married to Jack the plumber, nice guy, and then all of a sudden Martin Luther King walks into your life. Wow. It was that contrast.
well, thank you so much, because I didn't know anything about her, and it always amazes me what women before us did to bring us to where we are today. But to think that this goes back to the 1700s just boggles my mind that somebody
Yeah.
of her caliber was doing what she was doing back then.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Well, her house, the Sargent House Museum, I don't know what their hours are going to be this year, but it's beautiful. It's a really beautiful house right in Gloucester.
And I think you made a really poignant opening statement when you said how many copies were coming out of that family.
Oh, I
house?
I know.
So,
Yeah.
well, thank you again.
Nothing says we're important than a bunch of Copley portraits, right?
Yeah, nothing says success like excess. So on that note, thank you again, Bonnie. That was a really wonderful and
Yes, thank you.
Very welcome.
Really appreciate it. And welcome, good kickoff
Excellent.
to the month for the Actors Studio. Best of luck for all your events that you're going to host, whether it be virtual, Zoom, or in person. So best of luck to all. So good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.